The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Raquel's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the wind show remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Have you heard of the secret Scottish society with penis-shaped drinking glasses? Or the bat-winged sex demon of Zanzibar? Join me, Annie Harrison, to talk about these and much more in the Amorous Histories podcast. Each episode, I'll be exploring something different from the history of sex and sexuality, learning about what weird and wonderful things people have been getting up to across the world. To listen or to learn more about the Amorous Histories podcast, just go to amoroushistories.co.uk.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster. This is season 5 and we are going international, by which I mean looking at places that are not Tudor England. And I could find the names of 2 members of the Tits Out Brigade who suggested this woman. I feel like other people might have, and I apologize if you did and I don't show you out here. My inbox is not super organized. But Lori suggested her, also Courtney did, and also thank you so much to Tits Out Brigade members Sasha and Stephanie, who helped answer some of my questions about my research that I was doing, as well as friend of the podcast Alison Epstein for information on Russian and Ukrainian history, as well as Vaisel, who I don't think is a listener, but who is my friend's partner and a Turkish person, and so he was helpful with some pronunciation stuff. So for this episode, when a Turkish or an Arabic or a Persian name or word comes up, I will be doing my best to pronounce the words and names in the Turkish or Arabic or Persian way. Please know that several people help me with this, and if I mess up, that's all on me, not on them. They were very helpful. So some sources that I found super helpful for this. So the Ottoman History podcast, which is a great podcast I suggest subscribing to in general. It's called the Ottoman History podcast. There's also a podcast that's more kind of like a mini series called Ottoman Lives, which each episode is about a different member of sort of Ottoman culture. Like there's one about the concubine, there's one about the eunuch, there's one about the sultan. Very helpful as well. There's also an episode of another women's history podcast that I really like called Her Half of History. Talked about this person, and I also just in general recommend that if you're looking for another women's history podcast, Her Half of History is a really good one. And then a biography called Empress of the East by Leslie Pierce, as well as the Oxford Encyclopedia of Women in World History, an article on Daily Sabah, an article on Listverse, encyclopedia.com, history.com, as well as the Magnificent Century Wiki, where I read about how the characters are treated in the TV show, The Magnificent Century. And then also, I think this is the first time I've recommended I recommend there is the YouTube account in the Rani Did It episode as well. But there's a channel, all of these are linked in the show notes. If you're like, gotta get this research noted, so you can follow it. They're all in the show notes and also at vulgarhistory.com. I list all my research. But anyway, so it's a YouTuber/Instagram account called Barry Istanbul Tips, which is run by a person who is from Mexico. She's a Mexican expat living in Istanbul, and she does these great videos going around various sites in modern day Istanbul, which is so helpful for me to see like what, there's going to be a lot in here about various buildings that people commission, but to see what they actually look like, it's super stunning. So anyway, her Istanbul videos are great. And so a note on names. So yet again, we have a main character whose name both changed throughout their life, but also where we aren't sure what her name was to begin with. And we don't know how she felt about her name changing. So we just need to go with like, well, here's what people called her, so here's what we're going to call her. So we don't know what name she was given as a child. In Western European sources of her time, she was referred to as Roxelana, La Rosa, or La Rose, all of which mean the woman from Ruthenia, or the Russian woman, because of her birthplace, Ruthenia, which, footnote, I'll talk about in a bit where that is, so hang on. But sort of like with Melanzine, we do know what her name was changed to, and we know what some people who knew her called her, which was Hürrem. So just for continuity, I'm just gonna call her Hürrem as her name throughout, because at least we know that's what some people called her who knew her. So a note on sources. Spoiler. Hürrem ends up in the harem of the Ottoman Empire, a legendarily secretive and private place. So like they were not writing records about themselves for other people to know because it was nobody's business. Also note, I'm choosing to pronounce this word as best I can as to how it's pronounced in Turkish, harem. So not to be confused with the name of this week's featured person, Hürrem. And there was the episode ages ago, early in pandemic times. I did the one about the smallpox vaccine, where we talked a bit about how women were enslaved and brought to the court of the Ottoman Sultan. And in that episode, I pronounced it harem, but here I'm pronouncing it harem. Anyway, so some overlap with that episode from ages ago. So lots of European ambassadors and diplomats visited Istanbul because it was a really important place, but none of them ever went to the harem or met her. But at the same time, people of the Ottoman Empire didn't write about her during her life because that was just not what you did in that culture. Like it was disrespectful. So what this means is that most of the writing about her from her lifetime comes from European visitors who never met her, but who relied on gossip from palace servants, courtiers, and or their own imagination. So which is not to say that they didn't get some good juicy details, but it's just to say like this is all already kind of third-hand information. And then especially from the first half of her life, like before she got to the harem, it's like, here's what we imagine it was like. Also related to the lack of for sure accurate records about her life from her lifetime, there are also no portraits that actually look like her, because European artists were also denied access to see what she looked like. So you like the cover of the book Empress of the East, there's a picture of her. Like if you look on the Wikipedia page, pictures of her, like there's pictures of her all over the place. And a lot of those, or several of those, are portraits made in her lifetime, but those are basically just invented guesses of what people think she looks like. Like there's one of the famous ones is by Titian, the painter, and it's like, well, if you look at the face of this woman, it looks a lot like the face of like his wife or something. So it's like people just kind of guessing, well, we know she had red hair. Here's how we think she dressed. So like maybe she looked like this. I don't know. But there's a lot of interest in her. So people are painting her. But again, what did she look like? We don't know. So yeah, so it's a bit of a Melanzine scenario, again, where the woman herself is kind of a blank slate in some ways, where historians can easily fit in with a narrative to fit their purposes of what they think she was like. But like in the story of Melanzine, we do know many of the actions that Hürrem did, things that happened to her, so we can build up an idea of who she was. And unlike in the story of Melanzine, some of Hürrem's writings do still exist. So we're able to actually see how she wrote a bit of what her personality was like. So all that out of the way, let's begin at the beginning. Actually, no, I'm going to say one more thing, which is like in kind of every episode this season where I'm researching a situation that I just have never read up on before. Like I really delved in to learn kind of, okay, what was the situation here? Like, let's learn about the Ottoman Empire. And I ended up with something like 27 pages of notes, like for reference sake. Generally, these episodes I have like 12 to 15 pages. So I was like, okay, I need to just like really go through and prune out stuff that's just like interesting facts, but not to do with Hürrem's life situation. So I'm going to sort of sprinkle in facts like on a need to know basis about what the deal is with the Ottoman Empire and stuff. But if you want to learn more about it, all those sources I mentioned are great for that. And I just checked, and frankly, I still have 23 pages of notes. So like, buckle up. This is going to be a long one. So Hürrem was born around 1502, probably. And what's really interesting, or just sort of coincidental about this, is a few other people we've discussed were born at around the same time, including Melanzine, whose story has got definite similarities to this one. This is also around the same time that Anne Boleyn was also born. We haven't done her story in the podcast, but I feel like if you're here with me, season 5, learning about lesser known women from history, like I feel comfortable assuming we all have a general understanding of Anne Boleyn's whole deal without me having done an episode on her. But I mentioned both of these too because Melanzine and Anne Boleyn, both their stories are really, there's some overlap with what happens to Hürrem. So interestingly, they're all born around the same time. They're all like in the world existing simultaneously, which just blows my mind. I think they're all just out there breathing the same oxygen. Saida al-Hurra was also around at the same time, but she was a bit older. So where was Hürrem born? Basically Ukraine, but it's complicated. So as I'm recording this in March of 2022, there's a lot going on in Ukraine. And so reading about the history of Ukraine and Russia was sort of at a different sort of connotation for me, learning about it now in the context of what's happening in Ukraine right now. So for this episode, I'm going to be talking about what the countries were when Hürrem was alive, not like what the borders are now, which are causing so much devastation, this battle. So we're looking at 16th century, that region of the world. So starting with a people called the Rus, or the Rus, R-U-S apostrophe. So the Rus are the indigenous people who lived in the areas that are now Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And so they called this area, like their homeland, Kievan Rus, which people who spoke Latin were like, what did you say? Kievan Rus? Great. Ruthenia is what we're going to call that. And so that is where Hürrem was born, which is why she's sometimes referred to as Ruthenian. She's also sometimes referred to as Russian, but note in this context of the 16th century, that means a person from Kievan Rus, not a person from a country that is called Russia, because there wasn't a country called Russia until Peter the Great in the 1700s. Hürrem's birthplace is generally thought to have been Rohatyn, a city on the western edge of Kievan Rus, and which is today in the western part of Ukraine, and there is actually a statue built in her honor there. So not then. This was done recently. Because people didn't know her name, and we still don't know what name she was given as a child or went by, Western European writers called her Roxelana, which means the maiden from Ruthenia. So you see that a lot when people are talking about her. Like so many people from this podcast, nothing is known about her childhood or the first part of her life. Later on, some stories would emerge that Hürrem had been the daughter of a Ukrainian Orthodox priest. Her name was maybe Alexandra, but we don't know that for sure. Once she became, spoiler, better known and very powerful, retroactively, some stories started to spread to make it sound like she'd had an impressive life from the start, to kind of make the early years match up with what she got to later. And that's a lot to do with the whole myth of a meritocracy, where it's like, we still see this today with royal families and stuff, where the whole point of the royal family is they were like chosen by God because they were more important and better. So when somebody who's not royal marries in, then it's like distressing to that myth, because the royal family is supposed to be just for people who were very important from the beginning. So people, when they see how Hürrem becomes powerful later, they're like, but that doesn't match with our concept. So she had to have been important from the very beginning. And that's also, we see that with Melanzine, who people said retroactively, like, oh, her parents must have been like really important kings and queens because she became like, it just, and these things are possible, like they could be true as well, but a lot of where it's coming from is this sort of trying to make somebody who started from maybe nothing and became powerful, trying to match that up, because otherwise it just challenges the worldview of people who believe in the divine right of kings. So we're pretty sure Hürrem had reddish goldish hair and fair skin. It is not lost on me that I set out to do this season to help try and start representing better the international audience of this podcast. And we wound up with another person who looked effectively like me. But here we are. I feel represented. So according to some sources, Hürrem was very beautiful. According to other sources, she was not beautiful, but very charismatic. So again, it's the evergreen Cleopatra thing of like, if a woman is very charismatic, then you kind of like, you round up how beautiful she is because of the effect of what she's like as a person. For sure, Hürrem had a very charismatic personality. Otherwise, nothing about her life makes any sense, what she was able to achieve later on. This also comes across in the writings of hers we still have around to read, which we'll talk about later. So she was either very beautiful or not very beautiful. Depends on who was looking at her, I guess. Here's the first thing we know for sure. When she was around 12 or 13 years old, she was captured by Crimean Tatars during a slave raid and taken away from Rohatyn, and she never went back there again. Who were the Crimean Tatars? The Crimean, and I'm going to put maps on maps on maps up on Instagram to just sort of show all these regions, because this is a story, this is an international story. Hürrem starts off in Kiev and Rus and winds up somewhere else and makes a lot of stops in other places along the way. So the Crimean Peninsula, which is still called that, is located along the north coast of the Black Sea in Eastern Europe. The Crimean Tatars are the indigenous people of this region. In Hürrem's era, Crimea was known for its merchant and mercantile activity, which makes sense because they're like right on the ocean, and that's, we know from Saida and stuff, like that's where how people were trading. Merchants were all on ships, and so were the corsairs. So this activity included slave traders who bought and sold human cargo from nearby Christian states, including Kiev and Rus. These enslaved people were then trafficked to the Islamic Ottoman Empire. And just again, I mentioned this in the Sayyida al-Hurra episode, but I'll mention it again just to be really clear. Like, this isn't, Crimean Tatars were not the only people enslaving people and selling them, and the Ottoman Empire were not the only people buying enslaved people. This was happening all over the place, and these just happen to be the people who we're talking about in this story. The tactics of the Tatar slavers went like this. The raiding season was typically winter, when the freezing over of rivers and otherwise soggy terrain facilitated swifter advances. The Tatars moved quickly, laying waste to what they didn't plunder, so like just sort of like falling upon a town or a village and just like taking all the stuff, including people. The prisoners they took were poorly fed and marched on foot in chains before being put on ships to the coastal city of Kaffa, which is modern-day Feodosia on the Crimean Peninsula, which is where the main slave marketplace was. So these captured people would be either sold directly to owners at this slave marketplace, or they'd be shipped to Istanbul to go up for sale there. Male slaves captured in Slavic Europe by the Tatars would face usually one of two fates. Either they would become members of the Janissaries, which were the enslaved troops of the Ottoman army, or they would become labor or naval slaves captured. Female slaves faced different options, either toil as labor slaves or become servants or concubines for the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, which brings us to the Ottoman Empire. This was one of the mightiest and longest-lasting dynasties in world history. By the time Hürrem was born, this superpower had been ruling large areas of the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and North Africa for about 200 years. The leader, known as the Sultan, was given absolute religious and political authority over his people. The religious aspect is what makes a sultan different from a king, because he was seen as both the religious and political leader of the empire. Christians and Jews living in the empire were permitted to continue practicing their religion, but they had to pay a special tax to get to be able to do that. The Ottoman Empire made numerous achievements in the arts, science, religion, and culture. The capital of the Ottoman Empire was Istanbul, formerly known as Constantinople. And when it was Constantinople, that was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, which was now defunct because the Ottoman Empire had taken over and defeated them. So the Ottoman Empire, super wealthy. They held riches beyond anything imaginable in Europe. The wealthy and powerful wore expensive silks, bathed in warm-scented baths, ate food seasoned with delicious spices, and read manuscripts inherited from the collapsed Roman Empire. The reason, much like today's billionaires, that they are able to do to be so wealthy was because of the underpaid people who worked for them. And in this era, it was these enslaved people who supported the infrastructure. Enslaved people not only helped build these magnificent palaces and buildings and things, but also they really became the backbone of the administration. So this had been happening, enslaved people building stuff had been happening for a long time, not just in the Ottoman Empire, but everywhere. But about 2 generations before Hürrem, the Sultan was Mehmed the Conqueror. And during his reign, this is where enslaved and converted Christians and Jews became the backbone of the administration. The reason why this is who they enslaved, rather than Muslim people, is that they followed the Islamic rule that a Muslim cannot enslave another Muslim. So enslaving Christians and Jews was kind of a loophole to that rule. The benefit of surrounding the royal family with entirely enslaved foreigners, and so when I say they formed the backbone of the administration, I mean the advisors were all enslaved people or formerly enslaved people. Everyone around them. There wasn't in the story of Inés de Castro, where there was the de Castros were so important, and then the king was worried that they were getting too much favor, or in any story in English history where you have it's oh no, it's the Boleyns, it's the Howards, it's these families, you had to always sort of please them or they would turn against you. So to just get rid of that threat entirely under the reign of Mehmed the Conqueror, they're well, what if everyone around us has no connection to any powerful family anywhere because they were all captured and enslaved? And so that's what he did. And this meant that they didn't have to deal with the whole in the episodes in Scotland, the asshole lords. They didn't have to deal with, in the story of Dida, the Damara types. There wasn't these noble families competing with each other for the royal favor and or trying to dethrone him. So it just led to more solidified power with kind of less things to worry about. And also, there was enough fighting within the royal family that they didn't need rivals from other families as well. Because, again, just to compare this to past podcast episodes, because that's how my brain sorts this all out. So in the story of Fredegund, how there wasn't one son inherited everything. It's how many sons do I have? Great, I'll divide the country into that many countries. And then those sons fought against each other their whole lives. And it was all kind of wasteful and ridiculous. And Fredegund and Brunhild were what about not doing that? So here in the Ottoman Empire at this time, so they didn't do the thing where the oldest son of the Sultan automatically becomes the heir. Instead, any of the Sultan's sons could become the heir, which meant that they spent their life as rivals against each other. And then when they became older, they would attack one another with armies and or assassinate one another, trying to be the last, until one emerged supreme. And then when a new Sultan was chosen, he would have any of his surviving brothers put to death to avoid competition. So this is a situation where yes, you don't have the warring noble families, but you do have brothers literally killing each other. So, one or the other. That's the option they chose. And so this situation is a big part of why the Sultan did not have more than one son with any woman, and why the Sultan did not take a wife. So the mothers of all of these children were enslaved concubines who, after they gave birth to a Shehzadeh, which means the son of the Sultan, which is kind of like a prince, that woman would stop sleeping with him, Like, that's the rule, like that would happen. And then she would devote her life to motherhood and helping her son become the next sultan. So as soon as if they had a daughter, then you could sleep with the sultan again until you had a son. But this meant each Shehzadeh had a different mother. So in this way, no single woman would become too influential, because as soon as she had a son, the sultan stopped seeing her. So she wouldn't be able to like share his bed, like influence his decisions, etc. This also meant, the same as with the other enslaved people, the mothers of these children had no ties back to powerful families in other countries who might step in to defend their daughters or to advocate for the sons. So like, remember how in the Inés de Castro story, when Costanza married that shitty guy and her father came in and attacked, etc. Like, this is just avoiding all of that. So it just simplified things for the Ottomans. Not have to deal with in-laws, basically, because all the mothers of all the heirs had been forcibly removed from their families, and their families likely weren't powerful to begin with. But since every time a concubine had a son, she retired from being a concubine, there was a need for consistent new streams of concubines, which brings us back to Hürrem. So, at the time she was captured, the Sultan was named Selim, aka Selim the Grim, aka Selim the Resolute. And I really have to say I appreciate in Ottoman history that, unlike in, for instance, English history, where it's all like Henry IV, Henry V, Henry VI, and I'm just like, which is which? The sultans have a descriptor. So it's easy, even though a couple people have repeating names, but they don't have repeating descriptors. So Selim the Grim, aka Selim the Resolute, is who the sultan was. And at this point, he only had one remaining son, so they were skipping the whole battle to the death scenario. His son was Shehzadeh Suleiman, and Hürrem and the other girls taken at the same time were likely bought to be concubines for him, for the son. Suleiman was in his early 20s, and he was living in Manisa, which is in western Turkey, with his mother, Hafsa Sultan. And so that's the thing, like, where a concubine had a son, then when that son came of age, the son would be sent off somewhere to become governor and oversee his old household, and his mother would go with him to be a strong political advocate for him. So because there was just one son, Selim did not need more sons, and if he did, it's like, why would you do that? Like, Suleiman is going to defeat this, like, baby. So he didn't need new concubines, but Suleiman did. So Suleiman was described by a Venetian ambassador who saw him. People saw him, unlike Hürrem. He was tall and slender but tough, with a thin and bony face. Facial hair is evident, but only barely. He appears friendly and in good humor. Rumor has it, this is all the Venetian ambassador's notes, this is not me. Rumor has it that Suleiman is aptly named, enjoys reading, is knowledgeable, and shows good judgment. And the reason he says he's aptly named is that Suleiman is the Arabic version of the Hebrew name Solomon, and in Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions, Solomon was a king famous for his wisdom. Suleiman also had, I have to say, in the portrait you most often see of him, an extremely magnificent hat, which is very impressive. So, as I've either said or you've figured out by now, Hürrem wound up in the harem. She may have been identified as a potential concubine back when she was first in Kaffa and purchased by somebody for that task, or she might have been bought in Kaffa by somebody who saw that but wanted to resell her, so they brought her to Istanbul to resell her. At whichever slave market she was displayed at, Hürrem, like all the other captured people, would have been displayed nude alongside the other captives to be inspected for purchase. And if she was being inspected as a potential concubine, she probably would have had the very invasive virginity check of her hymen. But at some point, either in Kaffa or in Istanbul or in both, someone noticed her beauty or her intelligence or her charisma or something, and she was purchased to become a member of the imperial harem. This was not like when Melanzine was given as a gift to Cortez and was baptized and immediately sent off to be a sex slave. Girls chosen for the imperial harem were required to convert to Islam and go through several years of apprenticeship and training to be educated in the tenets of Islam, to learn spoken and written Turkish, and to learn about the etiquette required to live in the palace. So she was not brought directly to the bed of whoever she had been bought for. She was put into kind of 4 years of sort of enslaved princess diaries type lessons. This was because, unlike when Melanzine and the other women were sold as sex slaves. The girls chosen to be concubines were being chosen to become the mothers of princes, which was not just a job of like, hey, here, have sex with this person. It was a job of like, and then raise this son, advocate for him politically, potentially become the mother of the sultan. Like, before they were presented to become potential mothers of heirs, they needed to be like highly trained and then figured out who is the best of them. As a new trainee, Hürrem was brought to what was known as the Old Palace to live and learn. The Old Palace, which is later called Topkapi Palace, which you can visit now in Istanbul. And in one of the videos I watched on that YouTube account, it's gargantuous. It's so huge. So you really get a sense of the scale of things when you watch a video of it. So the Old Palace was where a lot of people lived. The Sultan's mother, the unmarried or widowed sisters of the Sultan, the concubines, and the children of the concubines. The Sultan, Selim the Grim, lived along with all of his male advisors in a separate building called the New Palace, where he did like politics, etc. The Old Palace also had administrative staff, female servants who served the privileged women, as well as eunuchs, who were enslaved men who had been castrated as boys to oversee things for the Sultan and to protect the women who lived there. In royal palaces like this one, the harem might consist of hundreds or even thousands of people. So it's a big group of people. Now, the term harem has been used a whole lot by people who don't know what it actually was, and this is partly because the Ottoman Empire, which I respect, kept their business to themselves and didn't explain how things worked to outsiders. Like, even at the time, people in the empire didn't know exactly what the deal was with the harem because it was none of their business. So Western visitors started imagining that the harem was a place of like nonstop orgies and sex stuff, which truly says more about them than it does about what the harem was actually like. The Arabic roots of the word harem and its usage over time conveyed two general and clearly related meanings: a space that is forbidden or unlawful, and a space that has been declared sacred, inviolable, or taboo. A harem was a zone in which certain individuals or certain kinds of conduct were forbidden. In other words, a kind of sanctuary. The women who lived in the harem were provided with female servants, ornate furniture, luxurious baths, expensive clothing, rich food, and of course, servants, aka enslaved people. Normal activities for the royals included supervising the housework, looking after the royal children, and embroidering. Although the royal women could go visit some female relatives or go to Turkish baths, like baths were a big deal and still are, they rarely left the harem because why would they? Like, everything they needed was there. If you look at videos or pictures of the Old Palace, which is now a museum in Istanbul, it's truly massive. It's like, if you imagine the biggest shopping mall you could ever conceive of, and then add like condos to that, and like in modern day terms, like, and like, I don't know, a movie theater and a skating rink and a bowling alley. It's like, yeah, why would they ever leave? Like, literally everything was there. Like, there's a school there, there's a mosque there. Like, it's huge. So it's not like, oh no, these poor people, sorry, I'm talking about the royal women. It's not like, oh no, these poor royal women like trapped in this place and they can't leave. It's like, this is the best place in the city. Why would they go anywhere else? The enslaved people also couldn't leave, but that was not their choice. The most important person in the harem was Valide Sultan, the mother of the Sultan. This would be a former concubine who, like Hürrem, she would have started off as a concubine, but then having been successful in the sense of like her son is the one who became Sultan. The Valide Sultan was the role model of all the concubines. Everyone wanted to be like her because she was the most powerful woman in the harem / the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire, but she had started out just like them. After her in importance, next was the oldest son of the Sultan, followed by the mothers of his younger children, then women who shared his bed but hadn't yet had children, and then women who might share his bed in the future. At the bottom was Hürrem's rank upon arrival, the novices. She underwent years of intense instruction by palace staff and outside instructors, and I think it was at this period where she started to be called Hürrem, which is a Persian name that means the joyful one. So apparently that was her most noticeable personality trait, was just this, she was like a smiley, cheerful type person, or made herself appear like that. Among the things she would have learned over these years, so she learned how to hold herself, how to dress, this is sort of like, I mean, this is Ottoman Empire, but like every fancy palace would be the same. There's similar stuff like with the Machika people in Melanesine's story. This is similar to like Downton Abbey, honestly. It's just like there's so many sort of unspoken rules that you have to be taught for the first time, where it's like, this is, you know, when there's 17 forks, it's like if you use the wrong fork, that's like a huge deal and your reputation is ruined or whatever. Hürrem was taught when to lower her gaze, when to bow, whose hand to kiss and touch to her forehead as a sign of respect. She would learn who she could speak to on what occasions, using what words, and when to remain silent. So a former Venetian captive described this schooling as, quote, "The most senior women who are accomplished teach the new and unrefined to speak and read, and also teach them to sew and embroider and to play the harp and to sing. They instruct them in all their ceremonies and customs to the degree that these girls have the inclination to learn." In this way, the Old Palace was an institution of higher learning for women who hadn't chosen to attend and who were unable to leave. It was the one place in the empire that offered a systematic education for large numbers of girls and women, and it was international in its makeup intentionally because the people there had been taken from all different places. So there's people there from Asia, Europe, and Africa. A new resident like Hürrem would likely be able to find others who spoke her mother language and understood her cultural context. That quote said, like, to the degree that the girls have inclination to learn. So it's like some people just took to this better than other people. And I have to compare it to America's Next Top Model, because as the training progressed, those of lesser talent, grace, or good looks became domestic servants. They were just kind of like, you're just never going to make it as a concubine, so like, let's just get you scrubbing some floors, sort of thing. So there was less and less people kind of in the running for the concubine job as the training went on. Like, they just found who this was suited to and who it was not. Hürrem clearly showed aptitude, so she and other people like her would be assigned to get sort of the next level of training, which was they were assigned to dress, to do the hair, and sometimes to entertain the royal mistresses by, you know, playing the harp and dancing. And this would, so as she got closer to the job, so she would get more advanced instruction in etiquette by spending more time with the actual royal women. And in that sense, the royal women, the Sultan's mother or sisters or whoever, would get to know her, and maybe they would sort of see her potential. So after she had been living in the harem for about 3 or 4 years, Selim the Grim died, and 26-year-old Suleiman was called back to Istanbul to become the new sultan. So he came along with his mother, Hafsa, who became the new Valide Sultan. So bear in mind, for the 4 years Hürrem had been in training to become his concubine, she had not yet met Suleiman or his mother or any of the women who already had his children, because they were off living in a different city. So Suleiman had 4 children already, 3 sons and 1 daughter, and they were Mahmud, age 8, Mustafa, age 5, Murad, who was a baby, and then also a girl whose name and age we do not know. So these children would now join the harem at the Old Palace, where their mothers would oversee their training, as they had done in the previous city where they were living. In terms of Suleiman fathering more children, like, he didn't just like be like, hey, guess what, I'm here at the harem, like, let's go. Like, he couldn't just stop by whenever. It was all, there's like rigid protocols, so it would all be carefully scheduled and arranged. His mother or one of his sisters would organize a reception, like a formal reception. Like, again, Downton Abbey, like, everything had to be just so. There would be entertainment at the reception. This allowed him the opportunity to survey the young trainees who served food, or sang, or played instruments, or danced as entertainment. And clearly, at one of these visits, he laid eyes on Hürrem for the first time. She was now about 17 years old, probably. So there's a TV show called Magnificent Century that was on a bit ago. It's a Turkish language TV show, and I remember it was really big on Tumblr at the same time that I was on Tumblr a lot when Rain was on TV. That's how I've heard of Magnificent Century. I've watched clips of it. I haven't had time to watch the show, but it looks amazing. The clips I've seen, I'm just like, this is great. And maybe people listening out there watched Magnificent Century and you kind of know this story and you're kind of cheering on Hürrem because, you know, in that show, she's like the best. So the show is incredibly sexy, schemy, very soap opera-y. Everyone should watch it. I believe it's on YouTube. So in the show, Hürrem is this incredibly engaging, scheming character. And on the show, she kind of like schemes up a meet cute with Suleiman. And then later when there's the entertainment, she like does a sexy dance and like makes sexy eyes at him, which captures his attention. So on the show, it's shown she intentionally makes herself stand out because she knows like having sex with him and giving birth to his son is her ticket to more power in this situation. In real life, this could have been what happened because the real life Hürrem knew this as well. Like all of them, all of the trainees and concubines would know like their ticket to getting more power in this world in which they are, that they didn't choose to be in, but like to make the biggest power maybe you could make would be to have the son of the Sultan. Hürrem knew that. Did she capture his attention with a sexy dance? I mean, God, I hope so. But she might have also have been presented to him by his mother or one of his sisters who would have spent time with her when she was serving them, and they might have thought like, ooh, I think he's gonna like her, like she seems really smart and interesting. Or maybe he just noticed her himself while she was doing something else. I'm guessing what really happened was somewhere in the middle of these things. Like, did she just kind of like sit around blandly doing nothing? Unlikely of what we know of her character. Did she like intentionally make eye contact during a sexy dance? Like maybe. Or was she just presented by a family member? Yeah, so she would have known that having his son was kind of like her best and only option to improve her situation. And after the chaotic series of events that she had lived through by now, age 17, like I would imagine she wanted some sort of security for herself, some sort of safety, because being an enslaved person with no children, like she could be sold off, she could be whatever, anyway, clearly she knew this is what she should do. And within 5 months of Suleiman becoming Sultan, Hürrem was pregnant, which immediately improved her situation. So her salary was increased, she gained new prestige as the mother of a potential new heir, and she would now be served upon as a lady, so no more was she serving other people. If the child was a daughter, then the child would be raised as a princess, and Hürrem would be permitted to sleep with Suleiman again until they had a son. If her child was a son, the Shehzadeh, then Hürrem would spend the rest of her life training and maneuvering politically for him, but then not sleep with Suleiman again. And throughout all of this, though, she was still, however, like as much as it's like, oh, now she's getting more, she's being served as a person, it's like she's still enslaved. Like she's not a free person. The way that this works is she would remain enslaved until the death of Suleiman, at which point she would automatically be freed. So even though she gets more prestige and more glamour and more privileges, like bear in mind, she's still enslaved at this point. Like the issue of, like the point of being enslaved is that she can't ever leave. But her son was a son, Shehzadeh Mehmed, who was born while Suleiman was off on a military campaign. And note, we aren't getting into Suleiman's actions expanding the Ottoman Empire, but just note that he did a lot of that, and that meant he was out of town a lot, and he became known as Suleiman the Magnificent because he was very successful. He was away, but even with him away, when Mehmed was born, cannons were sounded to announce the royal birth because this was a big deal. Mehmed was not Suleiman's first son, but this was his first son born after he became Sultan, and the first son of a Sultan to be born in Istanbul in decades. So already, although he had other children, Hürrem and Mehmed were overshadowing the sons born to Suleiman's other baby mamas. And when Suleiman returned from this military campaign, which was successful, his campaigns were, I think, always successful. He was very skilled. So he returned around the 1-year anniversary of him becoming Sultan, and there's this new baby son. It was like, wow, like look, in the first 365 days, like look at how successful this guy is. Like what a good Sultan we have got. But then things got sad very quickly. Within a few months of his return, 3 of his other 4 children died from one of the epidemics that was going around at that time, meaning he was left with just 2 surviving children, Hürrem's baby son Mehmed and a 6-year-old boy named Shehzadeh Mustafa, whose mother was Mahidevran, who is a character in Magnificent Century. So if you watch that show, then you know where this is headed. But this new state of affairs meant Hürrem was suddenly the 3rd most important woman in the Ottoman Empire, after the mom and then Mahidevran, the mother of the older son. But as Suleiman had gone from having 4 sons to just 2, everyone expected him to bring in new concubines to start having more sons as backup heirs, because he couldn't sleep with Hürrem or Mahidevran again. that was the rules. They both had sons. But then Suleiman summoned Hürrem to his bed again, and everyone was like, what is happening? So why did he call her again back to his bed? I mean, clearly he liked her and she was great, and who can blame him? But like, why would he break protocol in this way? Well, so Hürrem had been chosen to join the harem due to her potential. Like, she was spotted, maybe just because of her looks, or I don't know how much an enslaved person can show off their personality when they're there. But when she got to the palace, her potential became apparent, so she got the extra training to become a concubine because her intelligence and her cleverness impressed her teachers, eventually potentially impressed the other relatives of the sultan. So she's clearly charismatic, interesting, fun, and had this potential to take on this political role of being the mother of a future heir. Apparently she was also really into poetry, which was one of Suleiman's great passions, but he liked her doesn't explain why he would break with a long-standing tradition to have another child with a woman who'd already given him a son. Everyone was literally like, what is he doing? This is not what you do. And then Hürrem got pregnant again, and suddenly everyone was like, wait, what is happening? Is that Suleiman and Hürrem are in a monogamous relationship? And like, note, this is the first time a sultan of the Ottoman Empire had ever been in a monogamous relationship. As his favorite, Hürrem acquired the title Haseki, which comes from the Arabic word kasa, suffixed with a Persian gi, and it means to attribute something exclusively to. So Haseki, therefore, is one who belongs exclusively to the sultan. And this is like, before this, I think Mahidevran, at least on the TV show, had that title. Like, it's just like whoever the favorite of the sultan is gets that title. But she got that title because that's like the closest thing they could say to be like, this is the sultan's like one girlfriend. So I'm not sure if it was during this second pregnancy or another one, but so we get a lot of the gossip on the situation from Venetian ambassadors. And so a Venetian ambassador had a story to share that happened while Hürrem was pregnant. What happened was that Hafsa, the Suleiman's mother, presented 2 Russian maidens as gifts to Suleiman. Hürrem was apparently so upset about this that she flung herself to the ground weeping. Hafsa and Suleiman both worked to soothe her. Hafsa apologized to Hürrem for offending her and sent the maidens off to be servants elsewhere because Hürrem would have perished from sorrow if they had remained. Again, is this true or not? Who knows? But it's notable the story was shared at all. It shows Hürrem's passionate and maybe manipulative nature, but also it shows that Hafsa agreed to do what she wanted. So it kind of shows how much power Hürrem might have had. And it also underlined the fact that Suleiman was not sleeping with anyone else, even while Hürrem was pregnant. But not that he would have had much opportunity to do that, because he was out of town all the time. He was out of town for military campaigns for most of the second pregnancy and was not back again when she gave birth, this time to a daughter named Mirama. When he returned, they conceived another child, and the sequence just kept happening. So over the next 3 years, they had 3 more sons: Selim, Abdullah, who died as a toddler, and Bayezid, such that Hürrem, aged like 23, was now the mother of 4 surviving children, 3 of them Shehzadeh, the potential new sultan. Note, birth control was a thing at this time and place. So these children were intentional and or planned. In the old palace, Hürrem would have had access to the best women's doctors in the empire, as well as access to various birth control methods and access to abortion. So it's not just like, oh no, she's pregnant. Oh no, what an accident. So the situation was like Suleiman and Hürrem were intentionally having more children, which just led to how confusing this was to everybody else. Like, they were making this like nuclear family. Suleiman was not having children with anyone else. It was just like you can't, like, the level of confusion of everyone around them would have just been so monumental. And not just the people, not just like in the Ottoman Empire palace, but the people like in the Ottoman Empire, the people like ambassadors to other countries were also just like, this isn't how we thought any of this worked. Like, even though they didn't know how the harem worked exactly, they knew that the sultan didn't have sons with more than one woman. The everyday people of Istanbul didn't know Hürrem's name or what she looked like, but they knew that all these children had been born to the same woman, Haseki, the favorite. So, guess what? To the surprise of literally nobody listening to this podcast right now, rumors began to spread that Hürrem had, stop me if you've heard this before, bewitched him because she was a sexy witch. She was an evil, sexy witch, because why else would the sultan be so infatuated with her? as to thoroughly break with tradition, she had to be a witch. God forbid Suleiman just decided this on his own. So this school of thinking set aside the fact that Suleiman had reasons for wanting to change things like the custom of succession to the throne. Like his father Selim had had a whirlwind of violence in his coming to the throne. So Suleiman was like, what if we don't just let all the heirs battle it out, but instead have like one stable family unit and the eldest inherits? Like, what would that be like? So part of this whole thing is that Hürrem was the right woman in the right place at the right time. Like, you could look at this story like she was purely passive and just happened to catch his attention, and it just so happened he was in the mood to be monogamous, and surprise, coincidence, she was also super smart and clever and wound up being his perfect political partner. That's a lot of coincidences, and that also takes away from both of their agency and intelligence, though some historians do kind of think this was all just a happy coincidence, but I think this was... Suleiman wanted a certain kind of partner. He figured out Hürrem was that kind of partner, and then they began working together. And that is kind of like Occam's razor, what makes the most sense to me. So the concept that this is all just a coincidence, or that she's a sexy witch, this also disregards the agency and intelligence of both Hürrem and Suleiman, bearing in mind, like she was enslaved. So like within that, what agency did she have? She had some control over some things in her orbit. And one of them was knowing that having his child was the one way she would be able to improve her situation. After 3 years of training and watching the powerful women around her, she would know what sorts of women were being selected to bear the Sultan's children. And it wasn't just about beauty. These women were clever, politically astute, because the whole point of them was to one day hopefully become the mother of the Sultan. And Suleiman's mother and sisters and the highest up female administrators knew that these were the sorts of women that they should introduce him to. So these are the sorts of women they wanted him to have children with. So in order for Hürrem to become seemingly the first woman he chose to sleep with after becoming Sultan, means either she had a powerful advocate within the harem, like one of the sisters or the mother, who saw her potential and introduced her to Suleiman because they knew that she had the goods, and or Hürrem herself knew she had to capture his attention on her own. And both of these situations depend a lot on Hürrem's scheminess, either to gain his attention or to gain the attention and support of a powerful patron. So she was already displaying these qualities that were kind of what he was looking for in a partner. And then on Suleiman's part, yes, he had to pick the mother of his children from a pre-selected pool of enslaved women who had already been vetted for their potential. And he would also trust his mother and sister and administrator's judgment for who they thought would be good choices, and or he would have had to know what qualities he specifically wanted and try and find out who was like that. Because he clearly came into this job wanting to change and modernize a bunch of things. And potentially part of that was not just the idea to simplify succession, but also potentially part of that was he just wanted to have one monogamous partner. So even if he wasn't consciously looking for a woman like Hürrem, some part of him knew what sort of person he would need by his side as he implemented these changes. So him picking her and her making herself notable to be picked speaks to both of them being very smart, and all of this happening on purpose, not just like what a coincidence, I guess she's a sexy witch. So yeah, the other narrative is that like she was pretty and caught his attention because she was pretty, and then she was so sexy he decided to change everything about being Sultan, while at the same time she just happened to be extremely capable in taking on a larger political role. Happy coincidence? Like that relies too much on coincidence for it to make the most sense as what might have happened. So there's also counterpoint. So there's the one, this is another story where I was reading it where what the stuff I was reading was like, yeah, a lot of historians say this and a lot of historians say that. And I'm like, okay, I didn't read those first, so I didn't know historians said that. So there's a concept that she was just like a sexy witch. And then there's the other narrative that she was overly scheming, like that she tricked him into falling for her. She used her seductive powers to make him do what she said. She used him like a puppet for her wild ambition. And again, if you watch Magnificent Century, there's a bit of that, it seems like, from me having read a summary of Magnificent Century. But that removes Suleiman's agency and what we know about his intelligence and wisdom, that he would be so easily led to like change everything about being Sultan just because she's like pouts at him and like offers sex. So anyway, the truth is somewhere in the middle. of all of this. But note that for Hürrem to succeed to the level that she did, even at this point, having 2 sons with a sultan, means that she did really well in a situation where you had to be manipulative to get ahead. And everything I just said is also true of Mahidevran. Don't forget about her, the mother of Suleiman's only other surviving child, Mustafa. So Mahidevran had gained his attention before he was sultan and had his child, and so she had been busy at this point for like 6 years to her job, which was to train Mustafa to be the next sultan, to like make political connections so that other people would support him when he came of age. And she clearly did a great job, because by the time Mustafa was 12 years old, he was already very popular among the politically influential Janissaries. So the Janissaries were the enslaved army troops, and this was another situation where I read this and I'm like, oh, this is like in Game of Thrones. And I had to be like, no, Anne, Game of Thrones is like this. Because you remember there's the part where the Khaleesi frees that like famous enslaved group of soldiers who had all been castrated. And that's where Grey Worm comes from. So they were like the best. The Janissaries were like super powerful and really good troops of soldiers. And they also had some political influence. So this is a situation where there's not other politically important noble families. But in the absence of that, it's just like someone has to take on this balance of power. And that became the Janissaries. So sort of like the Damras in the sort of Rani Detta, the Janissaries were a very politically powerful group who could be swayed to support one person over another. Their support was incredibly important. And they, like potentially a lot of just kind of like the everyday people, supported Mustafa and his mother because they were doing what was expected. They were playing the game by the rules. Mahidevran had done exactly what was traditionally expected of a concubine mother. She did not return to Suleiman's bed after she had his son. She worked to make strong connections for her son so others would support his claim to be sultan next. And this is really, when I read this comparison, I was like, oh, totally. So at this same time, this is like the 1520s, over in England, like exactly when this was all happening, a situation with many similarities was playing out. So this is where Henry VIII had separated from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, a woman who was popular with the people and who had always done everything right and played by the rules. He'd separated from her in favor of his mistress, Anne Boleyn, with whom Henry was set to change long-standing traditions like of the religion. Everyone was really confused. And in both situations, the general consensus, both at the time and then for a lot of like, I would say like 20th century, up to the 20th century historians, the general consensus was not to blame the otherwise popular monarch because they were men and they were powerful, but rather to put the blame on the other women. So this is Anne Boleyn's fault for being a sexy witch. This is Hürrem's fault for being a sexy witch. And it was actually even easier at the time to cast blame on Hürrem because unlike Anne Boleyn, Hürrem had no powerful family also lobbying for her or to back her up. Hürrem was enslaved, had no power at all other than what was conferred upon her by Suleiman, but he was powerful, and as long as she was Haseki, his favorite, she was going to be cared for. So obviously there were hard feelings between Hürrem and Mahidevran. How could there not be? As Suleiman made it official with Hürrem, he started marrying off many of the other concubines and enslaved women, so just kind of like letting them know, like, you just don't have a chance here. Like, you're never going to have his children. Like, get out of here. So sort of like, now I'm thinking it's kind of like in The Bachelor, where it's like, when less and less women are there, then the competition between who's left becomes even more fierce. So Hürrem and Mahidevran were kind of concubines. Like, there just weren't any other ones around, which make their rivalry even more ferocious, one would assume, given that they already had the sort of personality that would have gotten them the job of sleeping with him in the first place. So the whole thing with the secrecy and the privacy of the Hürrem means we don't know what their relationship was like at all, but there were clues just from what we know of what these women would have been like, what they had to have been like to have been chosen to have his children. So Mahidevran, like, her whole point of her life at this point was to advocate for her son, to have him become the next sultan. But Hürrem's status as the favorite was a huge obstacle for her. After all, how could Mustafa compete with the children of a woman who spent so much time with the sultan? Now, no idea how this guy got this info, but it's a great story. And from around this time, the ambassador from Venice, messy bitch living for drama, sharing all the gossip, reported that the following happened. Quote, This is his quote. Like when he says Russian, again, remember he means like person from Kiev and Rus. The Sultan has a Russian so loved by His Majesty that there has never been in the Ottoman house a woman who has enjoyed greater authority. The way in which she entered into the favor of the Sultan I understand to have been the following. Mahidevran understood that Hürrem had pleased the Sultan, wherefore she insulted her with injurious words, and words escalating to deeds, scratched her all over her face and mussed her clothing, saying, "Traitor, sold meat, you want to compete with me?" So, if you were following that or not, he's just saying that Mahidevran, hearing that Hürrem had sex with Suleiman, yelled at her, called her sold meat, was like, "You want to compete with me?" and then scratched her on the face and pulled out her hair. Does this sequence happen in Magnificent Century? Did I watch a clip of it? Yes, I did. So the Russian ambassador continues. A few days later, the Sultan had Hürrem summoned for his pleasure. She did not let this opportunity pass and angrily told the eunuch who had come to fetch her that she wasn't worthy to come into the presence of the Sultan because being sold meat and having her face completely spoiled and being almost bald, she recognized that she would offend the majesty of such a Sultan by coming before him. These words were related to the Sultan and induced in him an even greater desire to have her come to him, and he commanded again that she come. He wanted to understand why she would not come and why she had sent him such a message. Hürrem related what had happened with Mahidevran, accompanying her words with tears and showing the Sultan her face, which still bore the scratches, and how her hair had been pulled out. The angry Sultan sent for Mahidevran and asked her if what the other woman had said was true. Mahidevran responded it was, and that she had done no less to her than she deserved. She believed that all the women should yield to her and recognize her as mistress, since she had been in service to His Majesty first. So that's Mahidevran. Believed all the women should yield to her, Mahidevran, because she had been in service to His Majesty first. These words inflamed the Sultan even more for the reason that he no longer wanted her, and he gave all his love to Hürrem. So, this extremely exciting sequence of events was written in like 3 decades after it allegedly happened. But this is one of the main stories anyone has ever written about what Hürrem was actually like and what the mood was between her and Mahidevran, and it has become a famous story. And the way that Hürrem allegedly acts here, which seems to be manipulating the Sultan and the eunuch who came to fetch her for sympathy, makes sense, because the training of royal mothers prepared them to be manipulative, because they had to be, because their whole job advocating for their sons was to make these political connections. Mahidevran's insult, calling her sold meat, implies that Hürrem had been bought directly from the slave market, whereas presumably Mahidevran had arrived in the palace in a more refined way, like, maybe being officially presented as a slave rather than being sold meat. But the story also shows that how much Suleiman cared for Hürrem. Like, hearing that she'd been attacked, he took her side immediately. So, bear in mind, Hürrem and Mahidevran would have lived together for like 13 years in the old palace, while Hürrem had child after child and Mahidevran still had just the one. And why just for 13 years? Because after 13 years, Mustafa came of age and he was sent off to be governor of Manisa, with his mother accompanying him. And this was, again, the traditional thing that was supposed to happen. The son would go off somewhere and the mother would accompany him. So the reading of Hürrem's life, that she was this nonstop evil schemer, some historians have claimed that she manipulated Suleiman into sending Mahidevran away, like banish her because she was her rival. But in fact, this is just what happened. Mustafa came of age. This is what happened. The mother would accompany the son. But having her gone would have presumably allowed Hürrem to relax a little bit with one rival out of sight, not having to see the woman who had like pulled out her hair and scratched her face every day. And that same year, which is 1533, Hürrem gave birth to her 6th child, a son named Cihangir. This was 10 years after her first child, so maybe a surprise, happy accident later in life baby, bearing in mind she is 33, that's not later in life. Or maybe she was like, let's have one more, like, I miss having a baby around. Cihangir was born with some sort of disability, potentially a hunchback, which did not get in his way at all because they had the best doctors on the scene and he was treated with the best medical care anyone could be in Istanbul in the 16th century. And then 1 year after Cihangir's birth, Suleiman's mother Hafsa Valide Sultan passed away. So just a bit about Hafsa. She had been born probably in Venice and then was enslaved and captured. And then her son became the new sultan. and she was seen by everyone as the ideal model of a royal concubine / mother. She had labored for the empire for nearly 40 years with dignity and determination. And through her personality and intelligence, which again, these are the sorts of people chosen to have the sons, she raised the position. She might have been the first person called Valide Sultan. Like, she's the one who maybe made that role be as influential and powerful as it was. One of the roles she served during the 14 years as Valide Sultan was she was an important advisor to her son, and she also acted as her son's eyes and ears while he was away from Istanbul, but also let him know what was happening within the harem. So she was the one woman he knew he could always trust. So he went to her for advice and relied on her for letters and updates. So Hafsa had developed networks of contacts and ways to gather intelligence, e.g. spies. So she had kind of this network already set up that she was using and had used for 14 years to help support her son, who was, again, killing it as Sultan. So she died March 19th, 1534, probably in her 60s or so. And her death marked the final connection to the old regime. Although I would say, based on kind of the role that she herself developed, like maybe it was partially her influence that got Suleiman thinking, like, why don't I change and modernize something? Anyway, after she died, Suleiman worked to change things very quickly, starting with freeing Hürrem from enslavement, because he couldn't marry someone who was enslaved, and then, yes, marrying her. And I'm just going to leave you in suspense for a week because this is a really long story. What happens after this wedding is literally another hour-long episode. So stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, I would love to know what you think so far about the story of Hürrem. What do you think of the chances of Suleiman getting the Lady Jane Seymour Memorial Award for Outstanding Supporting Performance? Has he, at this point, earned it, do you think? Is he on the level of Pedro, Tunga, Thomas Keys, and Lady Jane Seymour? Let me know. So you can always send me messages. My DMs are open on Instagram, where I am at Vulgar History Pod. That's where I'll also be posting maps on maps on maps to explain, you know what, this is another good reason to have this be split into, because there's just like a lot of place setting that I felt needed to be done to really get into the story. Next week is just going to be like Hürrem nonstop excellence. So anyway, Instagram, Vulgar History Pod. We're also on Twitter at Vulgar History. New thing since the last episode is I have joined TikTok. I'm on TikTok at Vulgar History. I have not yet posted anything, but like I'm there squatting on that name. And if you follow me, then you'll be the first people to realize when I get around to posting something. I'm also on YouTube. Again, nothing posted there yet, but I have plans. So both of those is just Vulgar History, both places. And yeah, so if you go to the website, vulgarhistory.com, that's where you can see all the research stuff, show notes, links to all kinds of things there. And there's also the contact button, so you can send me suggestions of people who you think would be good to discuss on this podcast. And also, frankly, if you just want to give feedback on what we've talked about so far with Hürrem, maybe we can include some of that on the next episode. And also, so vulgarhistory.store is where you can get your Vulgar History Season 5 merch. You can use code TITSOUT for free shipping in the US, or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. Then also, I don't think I've mentioned this in a bit, but if you go to, so all the book links, like from the show notes or from the website, they all go through a place called bookshop.org, which is a place where you can buy your books if you want to support not Amazon. So if you buy your books from bookshop.org, if you go to bookshop.org/shop/vulgar history and buy your stuff through that link, then a little bit goes to me, and that's another way to support me and this podcast financially, which you can also do through patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. There's a really growing little community there. I really enjoy how when I post stuff there, discussions get going in the comments. It's fun. So that's where you can pledge. So any dollar amount that you pledge means you get early access to Vulgar History episodes. And if you pledge $5 or more per month, then you also get the special mini-sodes. So this asshole Hernan Cortez, for instance, is recently there. And also the Vulgar Peace Theater costume drama reviews I do with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. Keep your eyes out for the next one of those coming soon. And yeah, I'll be back next week with Hürrem Sultan Part 2. And keep your mask on, keep your tits out. Talk to you next time.
Talmor, Shishin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I'm the host and creator of Only One in the Room podcast. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's incredible Only One story. We talk to the realest of real people, dealing with issues like infertility, addiction, human trafficking, and body shaming. Oh, and we want to be fair, so we talk to some celebrities too. Oscar winners, New York Times bestselling authors, supermodels, and even the most decorated U.S. Winter Olympian. Everyone is invited to share their Only One story with our listeners. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone. Download Only One in the Room wherever you listen to podcasts today.